want to start by just saying a word about the background of Juncture. As Alex said, I direct something at the law school called the Schell Center for International Human Rights. It's based at the law school, but we've always understood its purpose to be broader than that, to serve the wider university community and wider than that, the human rights movement. Juncture grew out of an interest of mine, a long interest that I've had in thinking about ways that we might examine the complex set of relationships that exist between human rights and the arts, taken very broadly. So working with David Kim, who I'll introduce more fully in a moment, we developed a year-long series of activities and program that Alex just described, and I'll introduce David more in a minute. One thing I want to mention is that the symposium, which was in April, was recorded, and the panels are up on the Juncture website, available for you to see. And I'll put the website address up at the end of my introduction. There's a lot of other stuff that might be of interest there as well. It's been a really wonderfully rich year for me. I started with a very modest idea. All of the cool and ambitious things we've done are due to David's insight and commitment, and because of that, we're also going to continue some of this next year with some speakers and some other things that will be on the website. So I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, but before I do that, I'm going to introduce the panelists now, and then they will come up one by one when I finish. So our first speaker is going to be Yvette Alberdink-Time. She is a human rights activist whose work reflects her vision of a world in which millions of people will have the skills and the tools to participate in the fight for human rights safely and effectively. She's the executive director of an organization, Witness, that works globally to enable activists using video and participatory technologies to realize rights. Witness also advocates for, I'm quoting the language, scalable systems solutions that optimize human rights uses of consumer technologies and online platforms. Yvette's an advisor and board member of the Foundation Center, Access Now, which promotes the digital rights of users who are at risk, and Mahal, and is a co-initiator of BK at 24 FPS, and you'll have to look on the internet to know what that is. Our second speaker is going to be Marlene Theodore, who is the Associate Curator of Programs at the Yale University Art Gallery. Her position is funded by Jane and Gerald Katcher. Marlene is developing the gallery's new programs department, conceptualizing and overseeing programs that build on the current roster and envision new offerings that suit the expanded and renovated Yale Art Gallery. She collaborates across the museum, the university, and the community, developing partnerships across disciplines, including working closely with us this year, to foster programs that enhance and broaden visitor engagement with the works of art at the gallery. Marlene has supervised students in curating exhibitions, including the exhibits Many Things Placed Here and There, the Dorothy and Herbert Vogel collection at the Yale University Art Gallery, and Jazz Lives or Lives? Interesting. The photographs of Lee Friedlander and Milt Hinton. She's served as a critic at the Yale School of Art and a lecturer in the Department of the History of Art at Yale. She has a PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center, where her focus was on the art of the 60s and the 70s. David Kim, who I've already mentioned, is a candidate for the JD degree at Yale Law School. He took a year and a half off generously to be the deputy director and curator of this initiative. And just to say a bit more about the initiative, the goal was really to have a genuinely multidisciplinary program that looks at this intersection that I mentioned between the various arts and human rights. And that intersection occurs in a lot of different ways. We're going to address some of them a bit today. That program was sponsored by the Schell Center in cooperation with the School of Art and the University Art Gallery. David's also worked as a graduate curatorial assistant at the University Art Gallery and as a law clerk at the Bombay High Court in India. David has collaborated with Counsel, a Paris-based arts platform that stages multidisciplinary inquiries around the world. Before law school, David worked as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company, and he has degrees in American Studies from Harvard and Columbia. So throughout this year-long initiative of Juncture, we explored a number of interlocking themes, but I think a couple of them particularly come together in the overarching theme of our discussion today. We raised a series of questions about the ethics and even the morality of aesthetic representation of suffering, of violence, of atrocity. But we also examined the issue of whether art, in a sense, matters to the cause of human rights. Can art, in a sense, be effective? And effective at what? Well, in promoting knowledge, understanding, empathy, and even action. I hope that today's talks will get at these, but also some other questions. We've titled today's panel, A Duty to Look, ? Human Rights in Imagery. But I think our discussion will range beyond that and will address these questions of ethics and efficacy, as well as perhaps the possibility of a duty not to look. I'm not sure we'll answer any of these questions, but I hope we'll have a discussion that provokes a lot of further thinking about them. I want to introduce what we're doing today by telling sort of a personal version of the story of how we got into Juncture, and I hope that'll lead us into what we're going to talk about today. So some years ago, I had a desire to kind of reach back in my own life before becoming a human rights advocate and then a teacher of human rights advocacy to an interest in literature and art and film, and in particular in artistic expression concerning first the Holocaust and later the enormous body of artistic work representing or considering in some way the wide range of atrocities that have, in the last 60 or so years, come to be understood as violations of universal human rights. So what were the questions? Well, in some ways they were, what were the goals of all this kind of artwork? How do and how should we respond to it? Does it matter if we call it art? Does it accomplish some good? And if so, what is it? As I said, my initial interest was in the mass of work about the Holocaust. When I was making some notes, I did some Google searches, and it quickly led me to drop the idea of doing a PowerPoint that showed some images or even listed samples of the novels and films about the Holocaust. It's a huge corpus of work. I had a particular interest in this concept of a duty to remember and to memorialize. And I have visited Holocaust memorials all over the country and in the world, and many of them are hauntingly beautiful. Yad Vashem, which is the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. The Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach in Florida. And there are many others, from settings in a beautiful park in places like Portland, Oregon, to the tip of the Ile de la Cité behind Notre Dame Cathedral, to the Nazi death camp at Treblinka in Poland. But especially in the 80s, there was a development of what almost could be described as a genre of literature, fiction, drama, film, grappling with a wide array of human rights abuses. I think a particularly powerful example of this mass of work was the play later made into a film of The Death and the Maiden by the Chilean exiled writer Ariel Dorfman. First produced in 1991, and it's about the confrontation between a torturer and his victim some years after her abuse. And in particular, in that time, we saw more and more images of human suffering, from the earlier Holocaust photos of the liberation of concentration camps, to famous images from the Vietnam War, to pictures of starvation during famines in East Africa, to the famous photographs of Sebastião Salgado in 1986 of workers in terrifying conditions in a Brazilian gold mine. It's hard to pick one of these to show. The series is incredibly powerful. The art gallery holds a number of these. People climbing up out of the gold mine with bags of the dirt with gold to be sifted at the top. In the 21st century, I think we all carry many of these images with us. What do we make of them? I'm going to read a couple of quotations from Susan Sontag's book on photography, a really rich exploration of photography and the role it plays. Photographs like the one that made the front page of most newspapers in the world in 1972, a naked South Vietnamese child just sprayed by American napalm, running down a highway toward the camera, her arms open, screaming with pain, probably did more to incense the public revulsion against the war than 100 hours of televised barbarities. The art gallery also holds that photograph. She also said, photographs shock insofar as they show something novel. Unfortunately, the ante keeps getting raised, partly through the very proliferation of such images of horror. And we'll come back to that concern. So how does a photograph like this one by Kevin Carter from the 1993 famine in Sudan affect us? Are we still capable of being shocked? Shocked into action? Or does the proliferation of images start to numb us to this kind of suffering? Last year, the flight of refugees from Syria, which had been going on for a long time, finally gained attention when a child, Alan Kurdi, drowned after the boat in which his family was trying to reach Greece capsized in the Mediterranean. Activists urged that the photographs of Alan Kurdi, drowned on the beach, must be seen, in this headline from the New York Times, which generated an extensive debate about the ethics and effects of sharing such images. And they're hard to look at, but I'm sure most of you have seen these by now. Claims were made about the impact of these photos, including on policymakers. The headline said that David Cameron's decision, after some days following the publication of that photograph, to increase the number of refugees that the UK would accept was affected by seeing the images of Alan Kurdi. So I just want to mention a few questions that I hope will come out in some of our conversation today. I don't expect we'll touch on all of them, but they're kind of interwoven questions that I think our speakers' comments will touch upon. What moral or ethical considerations should influence decisions to take or share or view photographs of suffering or loss? Do we answer the question differently because the image is of a child? Why do some of us feel guilty if we look at pictures like the one of Alan Kurdi, and some of us feel guilty if we don't? Does it make sense to talk about a duty to look? What benefits can the sharing of photographs like this bring? What harms? To what extent do we think that images of suffering can produce empathy? What do we mean when we talk about empathy? To what extent do we think that such images can spur action to end particular causes of suffering? What is the relationship between empathy and action? Has the widespread use of social media changed the way we should understand the impact of images like this? If so, in what ways? Does it affect the morality of sharing images? Does it increase or does it diminish the potential positive impact? If we talk about using images like this, who are the users? What are their responsibilities? Do human rights activists have a particular responsibility around the sharing of images of suffering and of loss? Are there costs when a powerful image moves people to act on the relevant issue? In what ways, if any, does it matter if the images are themselves beautiful? Should we think differently about photojournalism in art photography? Again, I want to quote Susan Sontag, who reflected on both the importance and the power of photography and its ability to make us at least recognize the atrocity that humans are capable of. Well, I have a card missing here, so and the loss of power that are of those photographs in a world that has become rather media saturated. So this is a page from the Daily Mail, a London tabloid newspaper, about an article, and I'll go ahead to the next one, which is a little easier to read the headline. Images of starving Africans is putting off, we won't comment on the grammar of the Daily Mail, putting off people giving money to continent. Band-aid image counterproductive, warns Oxfam. British public is desensitized to images of hunger, drought, and disease. Only 1 in 5 believe they can play an active role in ending hunger. Advertising portrayals branded depressing, manipulative, and hopeless. And Oxfam announced that they were going to change the nature of their ad campaigns to show positive images, images of hopeful development. I think this page might raise some of our other issues about the way photographs might desensitize. When we look at what shows up on the right margin of the front page of the Daily Mail, alongside the images of a starving child in Africa. But the headline in the story about the way that the public reaches a point which is sometimes called compassion fatigue, which has long been described as a phenomenon, but perhaps is in its own particular form when it comes to what this is describing as the saturation of negative images. So going further on these themes, a couple of more quotes, as I said, from Susan Sontag. What determines the possibility of being affected morally by photographs is the existence of a relevant political consciousness. Without a politics, photographs of the slaughter bench of history will most likely be experienced as simply unreal or as a demoralizing emotional blow. The vast photographic catalog of misery and justice throughout the world has given everyone a certain familiarity with atrocity, making the horrible seem more ordinary, making it appear familiar, yet remote. It's only a photograph and inevitable. I don't mean to end on that as a conclusion to the discussion. I'm trying to represent a bit of the tension that she herself describes in the book between the potential and the power and the possibility of a kind of numbing. I'm going to close by reading something. It's actually quoting one of my students, an undergraduate in Yale College, who's part of our undergraduate human rights program at Yale, who was reflecting in a paper on one of the discussions at our symposium this past April. I've always been conflicted about the role of arts in discussion about human rights, especially as they pertain to representations of violence and suffering. Is the artistic medium valuable uniquely for its ability to convey the gravity of an issue through emotional impact? Or does it risk compounding the problem by oversimplifying what could be a complicated legal issue or a nuanced ethnic and regional conflict? Worse, does it trivialize the suffering of marginalized communities or abused individuals by attempting to translate their experiences into a product for consumption? I still believe that if the artist has the necessary authority, art can foster cultural and societal awareness of social issues more than can any other medium of transmission. Thank you, and Yvette.
really apologize. I had asked him to take the last part out of that video. My name's Yvette Alberding-Tijm, and I'm a human rights activist, and I think a lot of the questions that Jim raised are the questions I think about on a daily basis with the team of activists that I work with. And to start on a very positive note, for 25 years we have been supporting people who are using visual imagery to catalyze human rights change, and those videos and personal stories have changed laws to protect elders from abuse in America. They have put warlords behind bars. They have really delivered a lot of accountability and justice for the against the perpetrators of human rights. So before we get we start doubting too much, I know that video and visual imagery can have a huge impact when it's used right. So what I want to talk about is a little bit, in a world now where there are many images, how do we continue to make sure that this proliferation of imagery actually turns into more rights and more justice? So I'll take you through a rapid succession of images, very appropriately. So Witness was started when the Rodney King incident happened in America, when the first real citizen witness, a guy called George Holliday, captured on an old camera, captured the beating, the savage beating of an African-American man by 4 Los Angeles police officers. That put police brutality on the map, and it actually caused ultimately accountability for some of the police officers of that crime. But maybe most people experience that image because they happen to see it on the evening news. 5 years ago, we started seeing a massive proliferation of images. We started seeing people mostly in the Arab Spring sharing images of what happens when you live in a repressive society. And so we saw many more videos and images being shared by brave activists in places like Iran, for example. And even if you look last year in America, there was a lot of sharing of images of police violence. We all have known since Rodney King that police violence is an occurrence, but I think it's the first time that eyewitness video by bystanders who captured police violence became so that the volume was so much, and it really entered on our phones and in our consciousness in a way. And this is a woman who is live streaming in Ferguson after the death of Mike Brown. And one of the things we're starting to realize now is technology is allowing us in real time to actually experience abuses. So going back to what is our duty to look, what is our duty to act when that actually happens. And the numbers are staggering. They're beyond our wildest imagination. There are 10 billion daily video views on Snapchat. The next generation, which is called Generation Z, is supplanting text messaging with just images. And Facebook is completely slacking off by having 8 billion video views per day. What does that mean for all of us when we are participants in sharing, capturing of images? I'm sure we all do it of our children and grandchildren, but what does it mean for human rights? And even this guy has figured out that there's an emotional power to the use of images. But what we care about is how do we turn that into action? Because as we've all seen, there are many images, but does it necessarily mean the fact that we can experience them and watch them and share them? Does it mean that more people have justice? Does it mean that we can end human suffering? So imagine for a moment you'd be this guy in Cairo filming a protest, or maybe you're a favela resident in Rio where the police randomly kill about 10,000 people a year and there's complete impunity. And imagine you're filming that. What are the key challenges that you actually have to overcome? So a lot of what we think about is actually an amazing unrealized potential. What if all these people, these first-hand witnesses, could actually, what if their videos would actually make a difference? So how do we unleash that power of citizen witnessing? And one of the key challenges is around safety. So somebody put this website together that's called We Know Where Your Cat Lives. So, because a lot of our data, all of our data, whether it's about your cat or whether it's about, you know, your geolocation, is online these days. So it's very easy to find people. Now, it's fun if you put a global map together of cats, but it becomes a different story if you were a protester in 2009 in Iran, where Ahmadinejad stole the elections, and people were really targeted and arrested based on videos that showed up on YouTube. So the security forces, the only thing, they never had to leave their office. They just had to go to YouTube and look, and crowdsourced the identities of people and arrested them. So at Witness, we think a lot about, you know, how do we protect the people who are in these videos? How do you protect the people who are filming? So thinking about visual privacy, we got YouTube to include a facial blur tool to protect the identity. So when needed, you can actually blur somebody's face so that they're at less risk. And this is my friend Esra Al-Shafai, who's a human rights activist in Bahrain. She's very brave, and she takes on a repressive regime together with a group of other activists. But she cannot have her image on the web. And what happens all the time when she tries to use these new tools like Facebook or other social media tools to get attention for the crimes that are actually happening in her country, her Facebook, her accounts get deleted because she's not allowed to be anonymous. So we think a lot about what are the policies that need to be in place for the people who now control this 8 billion video views a day. What are the policies that would make it safer and more effective for all of us to participate in the fight for human rights? And this is a video that I'm sure many of you have seen, the video of Eric Garner being killed after he was put in a chokehold by the Staten Island police. But we also think a lot about the other side of images and what happens to citizen witnesses. So the guy on the right is a guy called Ramsey Orta, who was the person who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time, and he was the one who filmed the Eric Garner video. But his life has turned into a living hell. He had to move from his home. He's been targeted by the police and by many other people just because he was trying to participate and do the right thing and expose what was going on. The second challenge we think a lot about, and Jen touched upon it, is how do you know which images to trust, particularly if there's such a flood and there's such a sea of images? There are these wildfires that happen on Twitter, and we've all seen them, and we share them, and we look at them, and do we know that how do we actually know that these images are actually true? And we have to be able to authenticate them in order to make sure that they can serve as evidence against perpetrators of human rights. So it's a really important issue to address. This was a video that showed up in 2011 that people said was a genocide being perpetrated in Ivory Coast. But we looked at it, and so did many other people. We said, we've seen this video before, and it turned out that the exact same video showed up in 2007 as a sort of a witch hunt against people in Kenya, and it was also claimed to be a violent act against Muslims in Burma. It ended up actually being the Kenya event, but one of the things we need to make sure is if we're sharing innocently or purposely because we want things to make a difference, how do we become very media savvy, media literate people in a world where videos are plenty? How do we do this in a way that actually makes a difference? And why that's important is, for example, we support a lot of Syrian citizens who are filming war crimes, because if you live in Aleppo and a barrel bomb falls on your neighbor's house and you pull out an iPhone to film what's going on, you actually are now documenting war crimes. So how do we make sure that people can trust your stories maybe 5-10 years from now when Assad is being held accountable for his crimes? So we're thinking about things like proof mode. What if every phone had a technology in it that actually captured all the metadata and made your video much stronger as evidence? We're talking to Google about that one. And we created an app called Camera V that really gives you a perfect sort of chain of custody for your video. So nobody can deny that video was when and where it actually happened. And the third thing that we see as sort of a really important issue that needs to be addressed is the ethics. So there are incredible opportunities when we all start sharing videos, right? So for example, the people we work with in Brazil, where the impunity has been absolutely rampant since the dictatorship. The one thing that is starting to crack that impunity a tiny little bit is the fact that citizens are now exposing and filming. So that's really positive. And then there are really joyous examples, like it's forbidden in Saudi Arabia for, many of you must have seen this, it's for a woman to drive a car. So this woman filmed herself and then invited a lot of other people, come share your videos, come on YouTube, show that I am actually standing up against the law that discriminates women. But what do we do when what's being shared is in fact the image of Neda Aga Sultan, who was one of the protesters, a student in the 2009 demonstrations in Iran. Should we really be there? Should we see this image? And if we share it, how do we do that actually ethically? And like I said, how do we not endanger the people who stand around her in this particular video that was shared by millions of people around the world as an act of compassion? Almost every single person who was standing around her in this video has been arrested. So there's a really important question around the ethics of sharing videos. So we do things like create ethical guidelines that give people, guidance on what to think about before you share a video. Now back to you, because you're part of this, right? Like the public is consuming and is sharing, and all of you, I'm sure, participate in some ways in the act of witnessing, whether it's in your own family or whether you're doing it with a larger goal. So just to give you an example of how important it is to think about the ethics of when you watch something or share something, is we have a project that's called the Witness Media Lab, and we're looking at what is happening online with videos of transgender people. And when you type in the word tranny on YouTube, this is the number of views that we're doing a report on that actually came up of people seeing violent acts against transgender community, abuse of the transgender community as entertainment. And in fact, the number below that is the number of likes that people actually expressed when they saw those videos. And also when we share, there's ways in which we can share images in a way that may lead to action and may not cause the kind of compassion fatigue that Jim was talking about. Like if you, David Haynes on the left is one of the people who was beheaded by ISIS, and there were people who very deliberately chose not to share the more graphic images, but share an ethical image. And the image on the right, going back to Alain Kurdi, the young Syrian boy that Jim spoke about as well, is we talk a lot at Witness, and we sort of do some thought leadership on this. So how do you share images that can show compassion, but maybe respect the visual privacy of people, or maybe sort of take a different take on an image, so that it possibly can lead to action. So we thought this was a very compassionate way of sharing an image and still expressing your desire to do something about it. And there's another way to think of yourself as a consumer of media, which is, in the era of live streaming, we've been doing some really interesting tests. It's like, as a witness, how can we deploy you beyond just being the passive person who watches a video? And this is a test we did in Brazil with somebody who's equipped with a live streaming camera. And when the military police illegally searches him and is about to arrest him, which in that particular scenario can be actually lead to a very harmful situation. He says, watch me, I'm going to arrest you. And the journalist who's being, the activist who's actually being arrested says, I'm watching you and 5,000 people are watching you with me. And that person is released. So we are doing a lot of work thinking about, as distant witnesses, how can we turn that passive viewing actually into action? So this is Periscope. It's the live streaming service of Twitter, which hundreds of millions of people are using on a daily basis to broadcast their lives. And this is a screenshot from a live stream of a Syrian family that is fleeing Syria. And right now, the only thing you can do as the watching audience is you can actually put little hearts next to it and say, let's give them hearts in support of our love for them. Now, that's compassionate, and that's very good, but imagine you could do a lot more. Imagine You could also summarize, edit this video and send it to a news agency. Imagine there were functions to this live stream where you could actually in real time step in as an asylum lawyer. So a lot of the more futuristic things we're thinking about is how do we turn distant witnesses into people who can actually take action for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to work with Jim and David in the context of Juncture this past year, so I want to thank you both for the work you've done with artists and the conversations that you've brought to Yale and to the community and to the art gallery. In my work at the art gallery, I think about the frames that we can use to see an object or an exhibition or an idea, frames that provoke contemplation, close looking, conversation, reveal a new perspective, create dialogues. This framing can happen through programs such as talks, music, dance, poetry, film. It can happen through wall labels, adjacencies within a gallery, or acquisitions, and it can happen through courses. Our work at the gallery is typically grounded in close looking at original objects. Looking can be about pleasure, it can be about interrogation, memorializing. It can be a call to action. It can invoke an ethical quandary. Among the visual arts, photography holds a particularly complicated place in this quandary, and I will quote Susan Sontag as well. She writes, "Ever since the invention of the camera in 1839, photography has kept company with death. I might add suffering, exploitation, spectacle, voyeurism, power, and on. Photography's authority is at issue as well. From its conception, photography has struggled with its identity. It's a document, a straightforward recording, or is it a work of fine art? Photographs have served as records since the 19th century, informing the public of issues and encouraging social change. Photographs are no longer accepted as objective truths as they once were, but they can still be catalysts for change, for investigation, and understanding. It also, we always need to look at photography's aestheticizing tendencies that might have a neutralizing effect, especially in an age that is so saturated with images. So I want to think about I am thinking at the gallery about the role of the photographer and the role of the viewer, how one is meant to juggle readings of form and content as well as readings of intent. And when does looking become a call to action? So in addition to public programs, the gallery's collection is available for classes. Entire courses can be taught through our collection. And Yale students are employed to teach the public, to teach local school groups, and one another. Graduate gallery teachers teach the K-12 population that comes through our doors, and every New Haven public school third grader comes to the gallery or the center, the British Art Center, twice in their third grade year. Undergraduate gallery guides give highlights and thematic tours for the public. And the images that we'll look at right now will give a sense of the kinds of possibilities that we have at this teaching collection to connect with courses, contemporary issues, and to bring about dialogue. So I'm starting with an image that you are all probably familiar with. This is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother of 1936, which Lange made when she was taking photographs for the Federal Resettlement Administration, which was later called the Farm Security Administration. This classically composed image of a mother with her 3 children captures the plight of the poor and the forgotten. In speaking about the experience years later, in 1960, Lange said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children had killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me." This photo, along with others of Lang's, of sharecroppers, farm families, and migrant workers, were published in free newspapers, which brought attention and help to this situation. Her humanizing approach, Lang's humanizing approach in her photographs, both broadcasted the consequences of the Great Depression and influenced the course of documentary photography. Susan Sontag has said, all photographs wait to be explained or falsified by their captions. With Migrant Mother, now an iconic image, what kinds of didactic information should we include when we display this work at the art gallery? A wall label with names, location, the conditions that this family was enduring, a quote, and then a quote by whom? Possibly someone who's pictured or the photographer, or information about what change was brought about. How this work is contextualized with other work in the gallery space also gives us information. So there are many ways to teach. We tend to follow a model of close, slow looking, so we might spend half an hour in front of a single work, and inquiry with historical and contextual information inserted along the way. Another familiar image is Nick Utt's villagers fleeing a napalm strike in the village of Trang Bang of 1972. Utt was born in Vietnam in 1951, and he began taking photographs for the Associated Press at 16, shortly after his older brother, also an AP photographer, was killed in Vietnam. Utt himself was wounded several times. Here he is capturing children, including a naked 9-year-old girl named Kim Phuc, fleeing from a napalm bomb attack on North Vietnamese invaders during the Vietnam War. The children are running toward the camera, it seems, and actually took Kim Phuc to the hospital before delivering his film, and the two have kept in touch. This image was initially rejected by the AP because there was a no frontal nudity rule, but an exception was made because of the perceived power and value of the photograph. Apparently, Richard Nixon thought the photo was fixed. He doubted its authenticity as a record. But according to Utt, quote, the picture could not have been more real. The photo was as authentic as the Vietnam War itself. I want to add that the gallery has recently hired an assistant curator of photography by the name of Judy Dittner, whose focus is on war photography. So we can expect more display of these images and conversation around these topics across the street in the next year or so. Early war photography was difficult and time-consuming. You had to make negatives on the spot. You couldn't really start working until the firing stopped, which is why most 19th century war pictures captured the battle's aftermath, or something like a medical station. World War I was the first war with official combat photographers, and by 1925, Leica was marketing a small 35mm camera that completely transformed war photography. So it's both the scene and the person pressing the shutter and the apparatus that they're using. And in doing research for this talk, I came across a number of photojournalists who say all they use now is their iPhone. Martha Rosler has, since the 1960s, made work that revealed the ways in which art and politics are intertwined. Playing with representation and using media and mass culture, she has addressed social issues and challenged norms. Between 1967 and 1972, she created this series, Bringing the War Home. It's a series of collages that mix photojournalistic images of the Vietnam War with photographs of idealized domestic interiors taken from popular magazines. These two types of images might have appeared next to one another in a magazine or on television, but they were always seen as separate, distant, unrelated worlds. Bringing the War Home brings together violent, devastating foreign conflict and images of the perfect and comfortable American domestic life. Together, it becomes pretty uncomfortable. Rosler saw Bringing the War Home as an act of agitation and of social commentary, and originally imagined that it would be published by underground presses and distributed by hand. She wasn't thinking of it so much for an art audience. In 2004, almost 40 years later, Rosler was struck by the similarities between the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq. She returned to the method of handcrafted collage, although she also used at that time scanning and printing. So she returns to this series of bringing the war home, marrying images from Iraq with contemporary interiors. There are differences in the two series, attributable in part to the passage of 4 decades, but there is also a disturbingly clear continuity in American policies and practices between in that time span. And in a sign of Rosler's success as an artist, the second series was released through a commercial gallery in the hopes of attracting more public exposure. An Mai Ly is an American photographer who was born in Vietnam in 1960, and she created a body of work called Small Wars. We're looking at an image from that series that investigates the representation of war through a series of Vietnam War reenactments in South Carolina, in which she herself participated. A bit of biography here seems relevant. Lee fled Vietnam with her family as a teenager in 1975, the final year of the war, and eventually settling in the United States as a political refugee. I should also add that she has a MFA in photo from Yale, and that we have quite a bit of her work in the collection, and I think we'll do a program with her next year. She said, "I don't think I ever realized how frightening the war was until I was actually in the United States looking at the news and looking back at footages. I think that's when I realized how scary it all was." These photographs occupy a space between formal documentary traditions and staged photography, and they highlight the aesthetics and spectacle of war. Notice where the camera is, where she's taking this shot from. It's at quite a remove. Notice the subtle tones of the photograph. She doesn't bring us inside this war because there is no inside. Notice the tension also between the natural landscape and the violence that we see in this smoking jet. These photographs question memory, and they introduce questions about reenactments, why people do reenactments. Is it to understand what their ancestors went through, what people had to endure, and how might this differ from viewing photographs of war? Lastly, I'd like to look at 2 photographs by the Iranian artist Shirin Neshat. These 2 portraits of Ghada and Saeed, both of 2003, are from the series Our House is on Fire, which examines Egyptian citizens after the Arab Spring, a revolutionary wave of demonstrations and protests around 2011. Neshat wanted, as she said, to, quote, go under the skin of people who had suffered. And she focused in this series on the elderly and the poor, and she asked them to open up their hearts and faces to convey their personal and national tragedy. So this work is about hope and despair, about the dead and the living, and it's about rebirth. In previous works, the people Neshat has pictured were playing a kind of role. In this instance, they are themselves. This is the closest she has come to documentary. In her work, she addresses form and beauty, she addresses content, and she also brings in this third matter of political and social reality. And I think that that's present in this series as well. So it's very hard to see. These 2 works are on display at the art gallery right now. It's very hard to see, but there is a veil of calligraphy in Persian on top of these faces. This series came about as part of an initiative from the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation to support artists working in response to social issues. Rauschenberg himself was politically active as an artist, and this commission carries on that commitment. After the series was made, the foundation then donated 2 photographs, these 2, to 33 universities, Yale included, and universities had to apply and explain what kind of teaching they would do with these objects. At the end of this month, a graduate student, Najwa Mayer, will give a talk on June 30th at 5:30. We'll give a talk on these 2 works. So the gallery is committed to making these works available for the campus and the community and to fostering dialogue around these objects. So we've been talking about the power of imagery. There's power in words as well. And I thought I would close by reading the poetry that is written on top of these faces. The poem is A Cry by the Iranian poet Mehdi Akavan Sayals. My house is on fire, soul burning, ablaze in every direction. Carpets and curtains threaded to dust. Within the smoke of this raging fire, I sob, run to each corner, shout, scream, yelp, with the voice of a sad howl and bitter laughter. And the fire keeps on raging, burning all memories, books and manuscripts, all landscapes and views. Putting out the fire with my blistering hands, I pass out with its roar. As the fire rages from yet another, direction circled in smoke, who will ever know as my being turns into the non-being by the sunrise? Thank you.
Well, thank you to Alex and everyone here at the festival, and thank you to my fellow panelists and presenters. It's been wonderful to listen to you and to learn already from you this afternoon, and thank you to all of you for being here today. In this last brief presentation, I would like to elaborate a bit on some of the points that Marlene and Yvette and Jim have already made. And in particular, I would like to be as precise as we can be about some of the sources of discomfort or distress or guilt that we might feel in viewing some of these images. Now, I don't imagine this list to be exhaustive, but I think it's a good start, and I do very much want to encourage us to try to be precise about the sources of our concern, our intuition that it's important to be careful in the way that we proceed around these images. So of course, all of you can read this. I'll just leave this for a moment. And then on the next slide, we will ask ourselves a few questions about each of these. And when I use the word subject here, there are any number of subjects involved in an event, the soldier, the victim, the photographer, the video maker. And when I use subject here, I mean in particular the suffering subject, or the victim, or that person who is the object of violence. So let's think first for a moment about this first point about consent. Perhaps in viewing the image, we somehow violate the consent of the suffering subject or the victim, whose consent we may not have obtained. And if that is one source of our concern, I would ask at least these two questions. What would constitute adequate consent? And this is perhaps a question to which Yvette may speak later. What would constitute that, and what do we do in situations in which it might be impossible to obtain the consent of that subject? It's worth noting, for example, that under US law, when one, especially an adult, appears in a public space, that is in effect an implied consent to be photographed, filmed, and to have that image disseminated. And so are there ways in which we can construct or construe consent in violent situations that might help us to address this concern? And what values or goals could balance against consent? So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that we don't obtain the consent, and this is in fact a real failure with respect to the subject, the suffering subject. Are there things that we can do, actions that we can take, effects that we can achieve through the circulation and interpretation of images that might outweigh the violation of that consent? Very much a question of balancing. What if we are violating the privacy of the subject? Again, the suffering subject, the victim. Well, we might ask ourselves, why would we insist on privacy? For example, we might often believe that one important aspect of privacy is that people can keep embarrassing or difficult things to themselves and not be compelled to share those in the public. Well, do we consider suffering an embarrassing thing? And if we do we have aesthetic and moral expectations about the way that people behave in conditions of suffering? I would suggest, for example, that deep in the back of our minds, we may have a kind of heroic ideal that suggests that people ought to suffer and bear violence in a certain way with a certain composure. And it may be the disruption of that expectation that we feel at times when we are looking at these images. And then again, as in the question of consent, what values or goals, what actions might balance against privacy and outweigh our concerns in that regard? What if our concern is that we fail to comprehend the entire meaning of the event? And this is certainly something to which Yvette alluded in her comments. One important step we should take is the verification of evidence. But I think there's also a deeper philosophical concern here, which is something like it's impossible to ever tell a full story about any subject. So if our concern is that the narrative somehow excludes facts or that the image doesn't capture all of the information in a given context, I think it's fair to say that this will inevitably be the case in any aesthetic form, in any narrative, in any image. And so that doesn't seem to be a prohibitive concern. We should then force ourselves, we should encourage ourselves to be more precise and to think about what particular omissions really bother us in any given situation. There is in all of this discussion, and certainly I find it in myself as well, a desire, a temptation to make general, even universal statements about the ways in which images function in relation to events of human suffering. And I suspect that it's probably best not to generalize in this situation. And as all of the images and videos that we've seen so far suggest, each merits its own reading, its own close reading, its own formal and political and discursive analysis. I suspect that it will be difficult to reach any kind of general conclusion against any of these questions. What if we are worried that in viewing an image, we are extending the harm of the original photographic act? This might come to mind with regard to some of the pictures of prisoner abuse and torture in Abu Ghraib. These images circulated some years ago. And one argument that was made by various parties of various political interests against the circulation and viewing of these images is that viewing them would duplicate or replicate or extend the harm that the photograph initially constituted. So we should ask ourselves, how precisely is the harm extended? And relatedly, what is the role of image making in that original harm? So imagine, I won't show them, imagine one of the images of torture in Abu Ghraib. These are war crimes under the Geneva Convention. Do we believe that the act of photographing, was that harm primarily a way of the torturers, of the soldiers making sport of the event, of emphasizing a certain kind of callousness? Now, if that was the kernel of the harm, do we extend that harm by viewing them again? What if we believe that the harm was the threat of the circulation of those images to specific communities or to the families of the victims of torture? Are we part of those communities? If we believe that to be the kernel, in viewing the images, do we extend the harm? What if we believe that the primary harm was the threat and the reality now of the circulation of these images of torture and humiliation to a global audience, of which we are, of course, part? Then are we extending the harm? Probably so. What if we believe the harm to be simply the fact that we are reiterating, re-inscribing, re-emphasizing a gross disparity of global geopolitical power? In viewing the images, are we participating in that in a way that extends the harm? And is that a harm that is specific to those prisoners or those events? I'm not sure. What if we are worried that in viewing images, we are vindicating the goals or the attitudes or the intentions of its producer? And what I think is remarkable about the moment in which we live now is that all of the same tools that are available to citizen journalists, are also available to the perpetrators of human rights abuses. And the Islamic State, for example, is quite active in producing videos about its activities, in documenting its own torture, its own military excursions and such. So if that's the case, how do we experience those images? And should the motivations and intentions of the producer figure here? Sontag alludes to this, and the other panelists have alluded to it in various forms. What if we're worried that in viewing an image of suffering, we have or will have an ethically objectionable response? What if we are aroused or desirous or indifferent or bored? If we feel any of those things, is that reason enough not to look at the image? Is that a defect in the image, or is that a defect in our own response? And if you believe any of those to be objectionable, which reactions would be preferable? And then finally, we might have a concern that we are aestheticizing or beautifying an event or suffering subject in a way that is inappropriate. And first here I would draw a distinction between aestheticization and beautification. Aestheticization, probably the imposition of any form, and formal qualities are inevitable. If we frame something, if we freeze it in an image, if we make a video which is a sequence of events, this is imposing form. This is creating an aesthetic to the medium, in the media. And so that seems inevitable. Perhaps we're worried about beautification, and if that's the case, then what do we mean by it? So these are quite a number of questions, and I don't expect this to be comprehensive, but again, just trying to provide some vocabulary to characterize some of the things that we might be feeling in looking at these images. Now I would like to show two video clips, and a disclaimer is merited here. These are clips excerpted from one of the videos released by the Islamic State in 2014 of the execution of a number of Syrian soldiers. I have omitted the scene of beheading itself and have done my best to avoid any images of violence. But I think it important for us to view these as well, because the same aesthetic questions that we raise with regard to citizen journalism, with regard to social documentary, are also present when we experience these. And all of these images are in the world at the same time, drawing on the same aesthetic conventions, drawing on the same tropes, participating in the same political conversations. And if we believe, in fact, that aesthetics have power, then I think we also need to grapple with these. Jim and I taught these in the fall, and I had to watch them a number of times in preparing to teach, and it was immensely difficult. And I carried them around in the body, weightily for quite some time. And I really don't know what it means that they exist, and I really don't know what it means to experience them. And so I also present them to you in hopes that we can together perhaps further a kind of comprehension or coherent response to them. I do want to provide you that qualification, that warning. If anyone doesn't want to watch them, I'll pause for a few minutes while the video is queued, and please feel free to cover your eyes or step out or anything. I would certainly understand. Great, and may I have the first video then, please? I should note that the video, well, I'll tell you in a moment.
أمتي قد لاح فجر فارقب النصر المبين.
أعلنت القوات الصليبية الغازية سقوط بغداد في 6 من شهر صفر من عام 1424 من الهجرة النبوية. وفي هذه الفترة التي اتسمت بنشوة النصر الموهوم لدى القوات الصليبية الغازية، كان أبناء الإسلام يعدون العدة ويتهيئون لمعركة لن ينطفئ أوارها بإذن الله حتى تحرق جيوش الصليب في دابق. فتشكلت بعض الكتائب والفصائل الجهادية، وكان من بينها جماعة التوحيد والجهاد التي أسسها الشيخ أبو مصعب الزرقاوي رحمه الله. وبايع الشيخ أبو مصعب الشيخ أسامة بن لادن رحمهما الله ليعلن عن تنظيم قاعدة الجهاد في بلاد الرافدين. ولم تطل المدة حتى انضوى تنظيم قاعدة الجهاد في بلاد الرافدين مع عدد من الفصائل تحت مظلة مجلس شورى المجاهدين. وعين الشيخ عبد الله بن رشيد البغدادي مسؤولا عن المجلس. وفي هذه المرحلة ظل حال المجاهدين بحمد الله تعالى حافلا بالإذخار.
That's the end of the first video, the first clip. I should note that this entire video is approximately 16 minutes long and is tripartite. The first is what we just saw here, a kind of political genealogy of the Islamic State. The second is the sequence in which the soldiers are beheaded, a clip from which we'll see in a moment. And the third is a kind of call to arms for those who might be persuaded by the video, and that's the section that comes third. May I have the second video, please?
لنا المرهفات غضاب البواسل لا تصيب حين التصادم فنحن الأسود وبات الضياغم نفل الحديثا بعزم شديد نفل الحديدا بعزم شديد إذا الحرب جاءت بلحن الرصاص نزلنا على الكفر نبغي القصاص يساقون للموت ما من مناص ونسقي الهدى من دماء الوريد ونسقي الهدى من
To Obama, the dog of Rome. Today, we're slaughtering the soldiers of Bashar, and tomorrow, we'll be slaughtering your soldiers. And with Allah's permission, we will break this final and last crusade, and the Islamic State will soon, like your puppet David Cameron said, will begin to slaughter your people on your streets.
So we'll just take a moment after that. Even with such editing, it's quite a difficult thing to watch, I think. I would just want to point out the obvious fact that the videos are quite highly produced. The production values are quite high. They draw on quite a diverse array of aesthetics that are relevant to all of the questions that we're discussing here. There are elements of the perspectives and the forms and the tropes of citizen journalism. There are elements of network news reporting. There are elements and sound textures from Western martial arts and action movies, especially in that beheading sequence. There are elements and conventions from social documentary. One of the things that's quite interesting about the footage, the apparent footage that we're shown, is that it seems to have the texture of damaged film, but it's quite unlikely that any of these were ever filmed, and so that itself is also an aesthetic convention that we might suspect is produced, something that gestures back toward videos, film of colonial training exercises in guerrilla warfare from much earlier periods. And what I want to suggest is that all of these conventions, all of these allusions to other genres position us to respond in certain ways, carry with them a kind of residue of expectation, change our posture just a bit, influence the way in which we might experience these videos in a quite complicated way. One might also ask, to which audience or audiences are these videos addressed? So let me just provide a few more questions, as though we didn't have enough, and then we'll go to the discussion. So what mix of responses is appropriate to such a video? And what mix of responses did you in fact feel? Can we imagine a pure response, an ethically pure response that only strikes one note of outrage, of disapprobation, of a desire for revenge? It's quite likely, I think, that the reaction is mixed, and we need an account of what that means for us ethically and morally. And how would we appropriately express these responses? What would it mean to express grief for Syrian soldiers who were executed? What would it mean to express outrage against specific individuals in the video? These are, after all, images, moving images. None of these people are present. So what does it mean for us to express those sentiments with regard to an image? And a third question, what's the relationship between the experience of the image, time, and the kinds of ethical questions that we are describing? Imagine three kinds of images, all of which we've seen here today. One is migrant mother, It was made in the first half of the 20th century during a historical moment that's finished as part of a government program that's finished. It is decidedly in the past. What do we feel when we look at it, when we experience it? What do we think? Now, imagine a second kind of image, these Islamic State videos. The beheadings themselves are finished. The conflict continues. What does it mean to experience them now? And what would it feel like to experience these in a gallery at the Museum of Modern Art in 30 years as a retrospective about video culture in the early 21st century? It's perfectly reasonable that that might happen. How would it feel to view them in a gallery? How would we respond differently? And imagine a third case, watching an instance of human rights violations via live stream on Periscope or on YouTube. What's the mode of response that's appropriate then? What does it feel like? What's the affect? What's the cognition? What's the response that occurs there? All of these temporalities are quite different, and I think it's useful to think about this dimension of our response as we shift into the conversation and in general as we encounter these images. So thanks very much. And at this moment, I would ask that the other panelists join me in the seats here. We'll have a brief conversation amongst ourselves and then hopefully also some time for discussion with you. Thank you.
Having a little conversation among the panelists, and then we will have some time, I think, to open this up to everyone else to ask some questions or make some comments. I don't want to try to force the discussion in a particular direction. We've all spent our remarks raising questions. And I really want to start by asking all of you if there were themes that have arisen so far in which you would like to comment. If not, I have some questions I'll address to all of you, but I really want to start by seeing if people had responses or questions for each other. Well, let me ask something, just really playing off of David's last remarks, which is a question about time. And I guess I want to ask the question to maybe lead into a larger question. So in some ways, David, what you were raising was the idea that we look at these one way contemporaneously, but over time something happens to them. They become history, and maybe in some cases, things that started out with a very didactic purpose, a political purpose, become art. We show them in a museum. And I guess the question I have is, in what ways does that matter? Should we respond differently to something when we see it on social media, when we see it on the news, when people are telling us that its purpose is documentary or even a call to action, as Marlene was talking about in some of the photographs that are now in the museum? Should we see it differently that way than we do perhaps 80 years later, 30 years later, or even a short time later when those events have passed? Is the capacity of an old image to somehow educate or change the way we view the world dependent on time? Does it fade? And again, I'd be interested in any of your thoughts about that, or not.
I would say for my work, showing the migrant mother as an image for third graders or sixth graders to talk about, it's still effective. I mean, it tells the story of, a family sticking together in poverty and persistence in the face of many difficulties. But there is something about the power of the struggle still happening that is, as I was saying, a kind of call to action. There is an imperative there. So I think that the issue of time, I think, is a very important one.
Yeah, I would agree with that from a slightly different perspective. So time can actually showing, if you expose a human rights abuse, time can actually be incredibly important to be very rapidly in front of people. If you're thinking about the killing of an unarmed man by a police officer, the timing is incredibly important. Like, we counsel people that you actually should wait 2 days until the police report is filed and then release your video. So, but how that video much later could contribute to a body of work that shows a systemic abuse is a different thing. And I think contextualization and purpose are incredibly important. So the same video, when used in a tribunal, might not violate the privacy because it's in front of a very specific group of people, and that there's an agency to use that video for specific accountability. But if that video gets shared to millions of people on YouTube, it's very different. So context is, I think, incredibly important.
I also think there's an important relationship between the way that we experience or access images and form, that is to say, the aesthetic. So if you imagine watching some of these videos in 80 years or 100 years in which the context begins to escape one, perhaps inevitably, form is the thing that allows us entree back. It's the thing that allows traction for our vision. It allows us, it focuses the attention, it provides us a point of access so that we can develop a new awareness of content and a new awareness of political context. And so, if anything, I think that rather than viewing form as a distraction, we might also imagine it as something, as a kind of preservative, actually, in a positive sense, as something that extends the longevity of an image or work and provides it a certain kind of historical vitality that it might otherwise lack.
That's such an interesting comment, and I'm reminded of a close-looking session that we did at the gallery with Amalia Pica, where I unfortunately cannot remember exactly what image it was, but we were looking at a photograph and we were talking about its power to communicate suffering, and she felt that it wasn't a powerful image, that the form wasn't as powerful as some of the others, and interesting.
Something else I wanted to ask about, and it might be a little bit narrow question in some ways. David, I'm going to ask you for that one slide with the questions, because it's a wonderful and difficult and challenging and rich categorization of the different concerns that looking at these kinds of images raise. I wanted to ask everyone another question, and maybe particularly Yvette, whether this is something that you confront in your work at Witness, and that is whether or not there is harm or the potential for harm to be done when images succeed at the things we hope they will accomplish. And I'll give a couple of examples where I think that might be the case in some ways. One is the film that circulated wildly on the internet in 2012, a film called Kony 2012, which was made by some activists who had a particular take, I would say, on the situation in Uganda and the surrounding region, facing people with the threat of the Lord's Resistance Army and its leader, Joseph Kony. And it spurred a lot, particularly young people who are on the internet, to have actions and speak out, calling for certain action by the U.S. government and by the world. Well, a lot of people were very troubled about this, partly because there were some messages that could be taken as, in some ways, racist and colonialist within the film, but more particularly because there were things that were inaccurate and that spurred people to call for actions that many viewed as not helpful and potentially even harmful. Another might be the one we've talked about, Syrian refugees. It created an outpouring from people all over the world saying, we want to do something to help Syrian refugees. Well, Syrian refugees had been leaving Syria for many years before Alan Kurdi was found on the beach in Turkey. To this day, I think most people who are calling appropriately and compassionately for help for refugees trying to reach Europe are unaware of the larger number of refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Iran, from both Iraq and from Syria, and from the enormous number of refugees in the countries of Central Africa. So there's this kind of sucking up of the image space and of our potential for caring. Something that a recent article referred to as our empathy for the girl falling down the well. Why is that where we should devote our resources? And I wonder if that is a legitimate concern, or if we just accept that even the best things can have negative, unintended consequences.
It's such a good question. In fact, when the Joseph Kony film came out at Witness, we did a sort of a moot court within the organization. And now I actually wish I had filmed it, but it was incredibly fascinating to see, because even within a group of human rights activists who know how powerful film can be for human rights change, there was a big debate about it. I think that to some degree there will always be unintentional consequences, but I do think there is a bottom line around truth, and there is a bottom line around the ethics of both the people are portrayed in the film. So the context in which we think a lot is who is, to your point, the audience you're trying to influence, right? So if you're making a fundraising video, you would still have to really abide by ethics, right? Because you're not going to exploit somebody's image just to raise money. But your message might be slightly more skewed to thinking about what will move this person to action. And I have a huge issue with how NGOs actually use images in fundraising videos for the most part. But on the flip side is if you're trying to influence, like we did in America, for example, with a video in which elder people told stories of physical and financial abuse, which is 1 in 10 older people over 60 in America. That video was screened in front of lawmakers and it passed a law. I had no problem with one of the survivors of that abuse speaking in a very emotional, compelling way, because it helped change the law. So it's a complicated issue, but I think it depends again on what the purpose is.
We don't have so much time, so I think we'll open up. I can't really see up there because of the lights, and there are a couple of people with microphones. Nikki, if you are up there and can just take the microphone to people who are raising their hands. I do see someone right in front because the light isn't blinding me when I look here. So yeah.
There's also someone in the back who raised her hand quite. Yeah.
And we only have a few minutes, so maybe what we'll do is take a couple of questions, make them quick, and then we'll try to respond appropriately.
I think that form has a really important impact. I think that one of the most powerful images of against war I have ever seen is the Guernica. And it was about the 1930s, 39, I think. But I think it's still very powerful today, an image, an anti-war kind of image. And the same with the migrant mother. I mean, that happened a long time ago, but there's a lot of poverty right now that we're not doing anything about. And I think that image can be a powerful image in that context too. So I think that the idea of time that you talked about, certain images are timeless. And I think maybe because they're evoking human conditions that are timeless in a beautiful way. And I think that just because it's beautiful doesn't mean that it's not helpful and intentionally doing a job of evoking the right kinds of emotions. So I guess it's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay, cool. Kind of going off of a little bit of what was just said and also earlier points about unintentional negative impacts of imagery. especially with regards to form and aesthetic, and maybe more specifically beautification, as you brought up. I actually had the immense pleasure of taking a class with Hazel Carby called Representation of Black Women Through Image and Text, and we studied a lot of Carrie Mae Weems, specifically her Slave Coast series, which, if you haven't seen them, it's a series of photographs off the coast of West Africa of prisons and sort of dungeons where slaves were kept before being transferred during the Middle Passage. They're beautiful photographs, which was one of the first things that I noticed. I didn't even realize what they were because they were so beautiful. And I just want to raise the question about that, as well as during Jim Crow era racism, the sort of commercialization of violence through aesthetics, through postcards that were sent of lynchings that were widely distributed in the South as something that could be bought and something that was for pleasure. And so I just want to sort of raise the question of not just the beautification of suffering, but the commercialization of suffering, and maybe even its relationship to time and its effect.
Given the time, which is basically at 0, maybe we should just see if everybody has a quick response to those 2 questions. I'm sorry we don't have a little more time. And
I can do a really brief response to that question. I think that that still happens today. Like when newspapers use specific images from Ferguson, for example, to sell newspapers, as opposed to images of communities who are sweeping the streets. That the same dynamic, I think, is very alive today. So that's maybe a very brief response to that.
This might seem an aside, but someone just sent me a link today about this app that had been created for refugees called iSee, or for people to help locate refugees who are at sea. And it turns out that the app doesn't work at all. So, I mean, another way of this kind of like commercialization, and it was marketed as something that would help locate boats that were in trouble. So, I mean, I think those sorts of taking advantage and marketing is quite prevalent.
Right. Well, on the first point about the photographic series, I think it's important. I think this is the reason why considered and sustained engagement is so important. Because, for example, it seems like a rather pat answer, but what I mean to say is that the impact of that beauty, the way in which it reverses expectations, the way in which it shocks the viewer, in which it disrupts expectations and such, are only possible if we look at them for long enough and think about them. And this is why it's so important that we are also thoughtful about the kinds of discursive communities that we create around images, Witness, for example, or the work that Marlene does at the gallery. And so I don't think that we should place on the images themselves the burden of being fully self-sufficient in their meaning, but rather the kinds of conversations that we have around them make sense. And on the point about hurrying as though it makes a difference, on the point about the commercialization of suffering, I think we can both object to that deeply and then also figure out a way to engage with the images. I think both of those things can be true, and I'm not sure that the moral possibility or the ethical possibility of a richer act of interpretation need be preempted or exhausted by the complicated material circumstances in which the images are produced. I think if that were disqualifying, there would be very few images available for us to think about at all.
And I'd just like to add a thing and then say a thank you note. On the point about form and timelessness, I think David raised some of this, but we started the viewing that we did in the course that we taught with the series of prints by Goya about war. And I don't think there's any question that those still have power to affect the way we think about war, as does the Dorothea Lange picture, as complicated as it may be now that we know more about it. But the other thing, maybe taking off from what David said about the discussions that we have and our continued engagement, is the importance of context. A lot of these images would mean nothing to us if we just saw them as images. It is what Susan Sontag talks about to some extent. We need to place them within our politics. And so we know that the girl is running down the road in a war that has deeply affected all of us. We know that Goya was making images of a brutal Napoleonic war. We know that Alan Kurtzy was on that beach because he was part of a family that was trying to flee to safety. And it's that combination that makes them powerful. And I know that those of us who sometimes use images for our work are aware of the importance of that. And I just want to do something I think it's okay to talk about. One of the graduate students is a curator here, maybe you know her, but she's doing her dissertation on images of lynching and their role, and you could talk to somebody and maybe make an introduction, because she's doing very interesting work in that regard. And otherwise, I just wanted to again thank Alex and the organizers of the International Festival for all of the great stuff that they make available to those of us who are fortunate enough to be in New Haven, and for working with us at Juncture, and for Yvette to come up from New York at what I know is a very busy time, and Marlene not only to do this, but to have really been helpful to us in all the work we've been trying to do this year, and to all of you for being here. I'm sorry we didn't have more time at the end for discussion, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you.